You go from, all right, I'm going to have sex and I'm going to have a kid, to now, all right, we have to go through all this fertility stuff. I'm still not even sure like how kids are created.
Today, we're going to talk about, well, infertility, of course, and we're going to do it from a man's point of view. Male factor infertility impacts a third of all cases, after all. I'm Dan Bulger with Progyny, and this is Infertility. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into today's story, I just want to ask that if you enjoy this show, please leave a rating and review. Or if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Those kinds of things really help. Today, we're going to hear from Chris Callahan. We were introduced to Chris after he wrote a LinkedIn post about his experience with infertility. The post went a little viral. So viral that, well, we heard about it and gave him a call. In this episode, Chris is going to share why he chose to share his story on that platform and why he thinks it was so well received. But first, we need to get to know Chris.
My name is Chris Callahan. I grew up in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. I live in Hudson, New Hampshire now.
Chris and his wife Becca married about 10 years ago. He's in software sales and she's a paralegal. And apparently kids have always been in their plans. Well, kids and football.
Our second date, I said, can we name our son Brady after Tom Brady, the New England Patriots quarterback at the time, and he should have still be the quarterback. He goes, yeah, that's fine. I go, what about Summer if it's a girl? She goes, no way, I don't like that name at all. So no offense to any Summers who might be listening to this. I still think it's a great name. So kids were like a second date subject. I always wanted them. And she always wanted them as well.
One thing I always like to ask our guests is if they had any reason to think that kids might not come easily. For Chris, there was some suspicion that it might not happen right away, although there was no official diagnosis of anything that caused the red flag.
For several years, we had sex, unprotected sex, whatever the word is that you use, and we never had a kid. And that wasn't the goal. We weren't having unprotected sex to have a kid because she did want to wait till the wedding stuff was over, but it just never seemed to happen. We were like, that's a little weird. And I had a partner in a past life 5 years prior that I had unprotected sex with a few times and never got her pregnant. So I just kind of thought, must be tougher to get pregnant than you think it is. We never really tried. We never aligned it with an ovulation cycle. So we just figured that that might be just the way that it goes.
So at that point, Chris wasn't thinking that there was a real issue, just that things don't happen as easily as maybe some people think, which is very astute considering the natural inefficiencies of human reproduction at the best of times. But then his wife, Becca, started to experience pelvic pain associated with her period.
We actually saw a commercial about endometriosis. We hadn't heard of it before. And we're like, that's the exact same symptoms as her. And I mean, you're talking crippling pain that she was in. And it really sucked from like my point of view to be like, all right, is this just like what girls get for periods? Maybe it's just a bad period. But then I started to realize like, no, you should be able to like still have your job and live your life when you have a period. And it just was getting worse and worse and worse to the point that even having sexual intercourse was painful for her. And so we really explored those options and finally got a doctor who would kind of take her seriously. Like, all right, this is endometriosis. This is what she has. These are the options. This is what's going to happen. And she put it into really dummy terms for us. That helped a lot.
With an endometriosis diagnosis for Becca came some more testing to make sure her fallopian tubes weren't blocked. And while they were investigating that, the doctor recommended that Chris see a urologist for a sperm test. I want to pause here and say that I'm very happy that Chris shared this with us. As I stated at the top, male infertility is very common, so getting evaluated is absolutely a smart thing for men to do. And when comparing it to the testing that women must go through to evaluate fertility, the male evaluation is relatively very simple.
And I did a semen sample, and he immediately came back and said, yeah, you have sperm. It's not the best quality, but it's really slow, so the motility was slow. So in my head, this is kind of where the first hit came, where we were like, all right, this isn't going to be easy. So at that point, you have endometriosis, and then you have my slow sperm. So if you think about it, in non-medical terms, she has a blockage there that's making it tougher for sperm to get through. And then I have sperm that's like just not moving very fast. Those dual problems are really kind of like a nightmare scenario for a couple. But on the other hand, without jumping ahead, it made it easier from a resentment point of view. I think that it was both of us. If I had my issue, and she didn't have issues, she could have easily been like, well, I could be with any other guy right now, not dealing with this. So it kind of made it more of a partnership thing, and I'm thankful for that. We were able to kind of navigate it together because it was both of our issues, for lack of better words.
I have to say, I really love that Chris brought this up. And I don't know if resentment is the word for everyone. I think it can kind of go both ways. Maybe there's a fear that a partner resents another due to the diagnosis. But I imagine in many, many cases that fear isn't really founded. I imagine a big problem is the fear of resentment, or maybe the expectation of resentment. I mean, consider the idea that male factor infertility can sometimes mean that IVF is the only real course of action. And then consider the fact that IVF cycles fall almost entirely on the female partner. Again, I'm not in everyone's heads, but I'm curious if it's more likely that many women resent their partner for this, or if perhaps the male partner feels a burden of responsibility and worries that they'll be resented for this. I'm sure it's different for different people, and I'm very curious about this idea. So if you have any experience with this, please leave it in a comment, or you can message us on Instagram if you want to keep it private. That's at This Is Infertility on Instagram. But regardless of the root of resentment, his point is a great one. Getting not one, but two diagnoses for infertility isn't something to be thrilled about, but for Chris and Becca, it really meant that they were truly in this together, which is a very good thing, because for the couple, this dual diagnosis did mean that they would need to go straight to IVF.
It caused a lot of self-doubt right from the beginning, because the first thought is all right, like, you see all these people getting pregnant all the time, and you're like, why me? That's like the initial like first thought. And like I said to Becca, my wife's name's Becca, I said to her, and we were very honest, I go, I don't think this is gonna, like, if we have to go down this road where like we're spending thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars and it's unsuccessful, I go, like, our life was lined up to have a kid, like, this is what we wanted. I go, I don't think this is going to work out for us well long term. And she agreed. In your head, you have like this life that you think you're going to have, and for it to come to like a halt it would have been really devastating.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack for anyone diving into IVF. And unfortunately, the way coverage works regarding IVF, for most people, you can't really start a conversation about IVF without talking about money.
It is expensive. You're talking about anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 a cycle. And this is 4 or 5 years ago, and that's including and it's just confusing. And that's like, no matter how good they do at explaining it, no matter how good your insurance does at explaining it, it's broken down into buckets of medicine, in terms of like the actual medicine that they have to use for my wife, and then you have a whole different area for the procedure part of things, and then the storage of my sperm long term, and potential storage of her embryos. So it's just like, it's very, very overwhelming. And to go from, like I said, thinking you're just going to go have sex to have a kid, to now you're talking about shots and medicine and what this medicine does and the pros and cons and what it's going to do to her. And she's the one who's sitting there having to give herself shots. It's very overwhelming.
IVF is expensive, but as you just heard, that's not the only challenge. IVF is confusing, it's complicated, and it can be very stressful. And we'll get into this more in depth in a bit, but Chris actually did have some coverage for IVF. His employer at the time offered up $30,000 of coverage for IVF. And while this is a great amount of coverage for something that might cost up to $30,000, there are still all of those other challenges that people must encounter with IVF. And frankly, many of those challenges are only exacerbated when dealing with a benefit that only offers to reimburse expenses. And that's to say nothing of what happens for those who might need to do a second round of IVF to find success. But again, more to come on that. Now, for male factor infertility, a treatment that is often used to dramatically increase IVF success is called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. This is a process where an individual sperm cell is injected directly into an individual egg. The hopes are that many of these eggs will fertilize, and then embryos will grow, and ideally there will be a few high-quality embryos to choose from for transfer.
So we didn't have high quality embryos. We really didn't for that first round. So we go there. We're feeling positive about the whole experience. It was a Sunday, so what's the most torturous part, I should say, to kind of roll back a little bit, is you don't really know. So they take the sperm, they take the embryos, and then they let them grow for 5 days, and you don't really have any updates on what's going on there, how the quality is. Because I mean, you could end up with 8 viable, 20 viable, no viable, 2 viable, and they grade them.
Yes, it's true. IVF isn't like going for a knee replacement. You go in for a knee replacement, you pay for the materials and the surgery, and you have a replaced knee nearly 100% of the time. No, with IVF, it's more of a process, and success and failure exists more on a curve. Unfortunately for Chris and Becca, this first round of IVF did not result in many healthy embryos, and their first embryo transfer was not successful.
And they do the pregnancy test a few days later, and it was unsuccessful.
This transfer didn't work, and making matters more difficult, the couple had no embryos remaining.
Like, what are our options financially? What do we owe? You still have a decent amount of coverage left. You have to pay $3,000 out of pocket, and that will cover everything. We're like, okay, that's not bad. And we're like, all right, maybe it was lesser than we thought that first time around. Now, consider you're going these back to back, so we're like, all right, well, this is what they said. We paid our $3,000, and then we move forward. So you're going through December, Christmas season, same process. They switched up her medications a little bit based off of the previous unsuccessful embryo transfer. Now, she wasn't producing a ton of eggs overall, so there wasn't a ton to really kind of put into. So they really wanted to kind of increase the egg quality and quantity to give us better kind of success chances.
The second round was going to cost just $3,000 out of pocket. Now, I don't know. If they had $30,000 worth of coverage and already did a round of IVF, it's a bit surprising that it's such a low amount for a second round. And, well, a week before the embryo transfer, they actually got a call about that.
On January 10th, they called me, and said, hey, we made a mistake. You're actually not financially approved to do this through insurance. It's going to be an out-of-pocket expense. We made a mistake on our end, and we didn't bill for that first procedure, the first IVF. So you've already hit your max.
This is what we call in the business a billing error. It happens, and it tends to happen a bit more when dealing with a conventional insurance or a reimbursement program. But for anyone going through it, for those on the receiving end of the billing error, well, it can be a catastrophe.
And I'm like, oh, all right, well, that's not tremendous, because we wouldn't have done this if we knew we had to pay $15,000. So to their credit, they didn't stop us and make us pay that immediately due to ethical reasons of my wife has already gone through this. They're literally about to do the removal and then have the embryos grow and all of that stuff. Like I said, it was 10 days prior, but we were still on the hook for $15,000. So as from my perspective, I'm like, what is it even how does it help telling my wife this at this point?
It's a really, really big deal. But as Chris said, at this point, he thought it was best for Becca to just focus on the treatment, and he kept the financial part to himself for the time being.
I didn't end up telling her until the day before the transfer. I was like, hey, we have some billing things that we're going to have to take care of, but I don't want you to stress about that. But that was quite the shock to find out that we were on the hook for that amount of money. Now,
okay, so they go in for another embryo transfer. This time they had to stay in a hotel near the clinic as there was a big snowstorm that weekend. So that night they stayed at the hotel and, well, I just want to put out a disclaimer here. We're about to talk about football a lot more than we ever had before on this show.
So afterwards we go back to our hotel room. We're snowed in, and it's actually really cool because it was the day of the AFC Championship games and the NFC Championship games for the NFL. So the Saints played the Rams and the Patriots played the Chiefs in Kansas City. So we grabbed some food and we watched the first game and the Saints Rams game. The Rams ended up winning. So then it's 6:30 at night. We have the Patriots and Chiefs, and like I said, we were always going to call my son Brady, and I've been to two Patriots Super Bowls. They one against the Falcons, which they came from behind, and once against the Seahawks, the Malcolm Butler interception, and it was their first win in 10 years. And like I could have gotten to two better Super Bowls, and my wife knows how much like the Patriots meant to me and Tom Brady specifically, like for who he was and like what he represented. It's not just about being a football player, it's like him as a person. And that was really that game. They were decent underdogs and they came from behind several times and ended up winning in overtime against Kansas City in Kansas City.
I remember that. It was a truly epic game. And, well, let's just say Chris and I don't share a rooting interest in this one. Sorry, Chris. For me, the game had an annoying outcome. For Chris, it was a sign.
I had a few drinks that night, so I went over to my wife, and she was watching the game with me, and I was all emotional, and I was like, I really think like I go like this is like just like feels right, like we want to name my son Brady, like the Patriots won, like everything's gone perfect, and then like flash forward 2 weeks later on the Super Bowl, she gave me the positive pregnancy test right before the game, and we have our son Brady now.
Touchdown! Chris and Becca found success with this transfer, and sometime later, they welcomed Brady into the world. Now, about that billing error. It's hard for me to hear about something like that occurring without thinking about how much of a difference Progyny could have made there. Billing errors happen. It's a complex treatment, and there are a lot of moving parts. But the pain of these errors can be mitigated or avoided altogether when working with a benefit that provides real member support. Support like Progyny provides with our patient care advocates. Chris didn't have coverage through Progyny, but since his experience, he has learned a lot more about Progyny, and he sees what a difference it would have made for them.
And I think that's where like a service of like Progyny would have made things a lot easier. Having a support dedicated, because no, there was nothing. It was just all right. And I think even like from the billing aspect, that's where the ball got dropped. Nobody really kind of knew. They just it was a billing thing. It was a health insurance thing. It wasn't like a thing where there was a support advocate. No one really like knew anything beyond like numbers and spreadsheets and line items. And that's where having kind of more of a human approach with that Progyny does offer that I've learned about, and having an expert there on what you do need and what you don't need. Even maybe that second time around, I wouldn't be shocked if I know we did. I know what happened is that there was several $1,000s in extra medicine that we ended up having afterwards that we might not have needed if we just kind of had an advocate there. The money's nice, but having like more of kind of someone who knows this stuff would have been great.
Now, all that being said, it's not like he didn't have coverage. He did have a benefit, and that benefit made something that might have cost him $45,000 costed them $15,000, which is a huge deal. And it's not something that Chris took for granted. And sometime later, he decided that he wanted to share this story. He wanted to share that his journey to fatherhood was supported by his former employer, and he did so by posting his story on LinkedIn.
So I put that post out there, and just to kind of just wanted to kind of just say like, all right, there are other employers out there that do similar benefits, and if they don't, like, they should definitely consider it, because it is like you could get like your gym membership reimbursed, or you could get like your dog like walk coverage, but like it's just like this is something that's lifelong, and it's something that actually has an impact. And from a brand perspective, like the positive like publicity that you get from doing something like this is so much more impactful than those other things. And if we're being honest, the amount of wasted benefits that coverage that companies give, 30,000 isn't much compared to some of the junk that they do probably cover that no one uses or use and don't get a benefit from. So I kind of just want to put that out there. And then honestly, the response was just like it went like viral instantly, and the stories that I got, both positive and heartbreaking, was unbelievable. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. But that is kind of what the same experience has been when I'm open about it at like a bachelor party I went to a year and a half ago. I remember I just said, oh yeah, I said the whole thing about Brady, my son, and how he had him and the IVF. And then there was a person that I knew, like kind of like he was there in my company, but we weren't friends of any sort. And he told me him and his wife were going through like wondering why they weren't able to. And I just kind of talked to him about like the different things and how I'd suggest getting assistance sooner rather than later. And they ended up having a kid a few months ago. I don't even know I don't think they had to even go the full IVF journey. I think there was just some things that they had to get taken care of. But just how quickly he was to open up to me, a complete stranger, is the same response I've had via the internet on LinkedIn. Is just so many people, different versions of the same story.
Yes, and I think that's a perfect place to tie this all together. When we talk about this, others listen. And when they hear that these things are happening to people around them, well, then they better understand that they aren't alone, that this isn't some wild and crazy thing that will define them forever. They'll learn that this is treatable. And if we speak about it, and we're loud enough, then maybe more and more employers will hear this too, and maybe great fertility coverage will come to millions more over the years. I want to give a big thank you to Chris for being on the show with us today. And of course, I want to thank you for joining us too. If you want to connect with us, you can do so at Instagram at This Is Infertility Podcast. If you want to follow Progyny, you can do so at Progyny Inc. Of course, if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating and review. That's a huge deal for us. And if you're watching on YouTube, you know you got to smash that like button. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny. Please remember this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Dan Bulger, and this is Infertility.